Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we will dive into the basics of variables using processing with the Python mode. We'll examine a piece of code and I'll walk you through each part step by step. So by the end of this video, you'll have a solid understanding of how to use variables effectively in processing. Let's start with the code that sets up the canvas. So let's call the size function to create a canvas of width 600 and height 400. The size function takes two arguments, the width and the height of the canvas. In this case, we are setting the width to 600 and the height to 400. Next, let's set the background color of the canvas using the background function. Now, this function takes a single argument, which is the color of the background. Just a recall, the color can be specified in different ways, such as RGB values, hexadecimal values, or color names. In this case, we are using a hexadecimal value to set the background color. So let's pass in the hexadecimal value for a light blue color. Now hit the run button to see the canvas with the light blue background. Now we have our canvas set up with a light blue background. Now let's quickly print the width and height of the canvas to the console. To do this, we can use the print function. The print function takes one or more arguments and prints them to the console. I will call the print function twice, once for the width and once for the height. Now let's run the code to see the width and the height printed to the console. As you can see, the width of the canvas is 600 pixels and the height is 400 pixels. But notice that you never explicitly define width or height. So where did these values come from? Processing automatically assigned the width and the height of the display window to these two variables. In processing, the width and height variables are predefined system variables that store the dimensions of the display window. The moment you call the size function, processing assigns the width and height of the display window to the width and height variables. These variables are predefined by processing and are available for you to use in your code. However, you are not limited to system variables. You can also define your own variables. So let's comment out these lines and move on to creating our own variables. In processing, we declare a variable by choosing a name and assigning a value using the equal sign, which is called the assignment operator. This value can be anything from a number to more complex data, and we will talk this in a moment, but for now, let's create a new variable and name it x and assign it the value 10. Now x becomes a variable that holds the value 10. Now to print the value of x to the console, you can use the print function and pass in the variable x as an argument. Now let's run the code to see the value of x printed to the console. And as you can see, the value of x is 10. Variables are essential in programming because they allow us to store data that can change over time. If we want to use or modify this value later in our code, we simply refer to the variable x instead of hard-coding the value 10 everywhere. Now let's go over the do's and don'ts of variables naming to ensure our code is both functional and readable. So let me show you some examples of valid and invalid variable names. So let's start with the variable name player lives and assign it the value 3. This is a valid variable name because it follows the camel case naming convention, which is commonly used in programming. The word camel case came from the way the words are written, which resembles the humps of a camel. In camel case, the first word is lowercase and each subsequent word starts with the upper letter. Now let's look at another example of a valid variable name. This is also a valid variable name because it uses an underscore to separate words. And this naming convention is known as snake case. It gets its name from the visual appearance of the underscore between the two words, which resembles the way a snake moves with its segmented body. Another example of a valid variable name is this. Variable names can include letters and numbers. In this example of variable, the name contains both letters, player lives, and a number 2, which is allowed. Now let's take a look at examples of invalid variable names. This is invalid because it contains a space. In most programming languages, spaces help separate different values of code, like commands, symbols, or names. This makes it easier for the computer to understand what each part is supposed to do. If you put spaces in names like player lives, the computer gets confused. It doesn't know if player and lives are one name or two separate names. This can make it hard for the computer to figure out what you mean. So, to avoid the confusion, we don't use spaces in names. Instead, we use other ways to join the words together, like the camel case and snake case conventions we talked about earlier. This helps the computer understand variable names correctly without getting mixed up. Let's see the another one that breaks the rules. This would be invalid because it contains a hyphen. In most programming languages, variable names cannot contain hyphens because hyphens are treated as operators or special characters, not as a part of variable names. This means the computer would misinterpret the hyphen as a subtraction operator between player and lives, not as a single variable name. Another example of an invalid variable name is this. This would be invalid because it begins with a number. The computer gets confused if a variable name starts with a number. It might think the number is a part of math calculation instead of a name. That's why variable names cannot begin with a number. So to summarize, variable names should not contain spaces, hyphens, or begin with numbers. Instead, use camel case or snake case to create meaningful and readable variable names. Now that you understand the basics of variable naming, let's see how we can use variables to draw shapes on the canvas. So let's create a rectangle on the canvas using the rect function. Now we know that the rect function takes 4 arguments: the x-coordinate, y-coordinate, width, and the height. We can use variables to store these values and pass them as arguments to the rect function. So let's create a variable y and assign it the value 30. Next, let's create a variable w and assign it the value 100. And lastly, we will create a variable h and assign it the value w. We already have the x variable with the value of 10. Now let's call the rect function and pass in the variable x, y, w, and h as an arguments. This will draw a rectangle on the canvas with the specified dimensions. You have successfully used variables to draw a rectangle on the canvas. This is just the beginning of what you can do with the variables in processing. In coming lessons, we will use variables to create more complex and interactive projects. You can also experiment with different values of the variables x, y, w, and h to see how they affect the position and the size of the rectangle. So I hope you found this helpful. I'll see you in the next one. Till then, keep learning and take care.